We thought that automation would come first for the blue-collar jobs. Maybe you as a person have a moral obligation to treat it as though those are true, valid emotions and feelings and experiences. We are a, social media 2.0, and there's massive dependency and a loss of human autonomy.
They just take it for granted that they don't have any privacy. This future is the one that we build around the choices that we make now. Hello, and welcome to AI with GennAI. I'm your host, Jen Gennai, and today I'm honored to introduce our guest, Janel Thamkul. As Deputy General Counsel at Anthropic, a well-known frontier AI lab going through rapid scaling and growth, Janel drives legal strategy on AI. She helps Anthropic conduct cutting-edge AI R&D while navigating ethical and regulatory frontiers. Previously, Janel led Google's AI Research Product Council team, advising on the development of generative and non-generative AI, blockchain, biometrics, computer vision, and other emerging technologies. She also collaborated closely with research, product, and operations teams across the company on AI fairness, safety, and responsible innovation. During that time, I had the pleasure of working with her. Before Google, Janel represented clients in high-stakes copyright and product liability litigation and international arbitration at Frela Brawl and Martel. Janel, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Jen.
Well, we heard such an impressive resume there and all the things that you've done at the cutting edge of technology. But I always want to understand from my guests better about what's behind the bio. What was your motivating factors or trigger and points that may have driven you to have that more human-centered lens to the work that you do?
Yeah, so I think it started young. I've always cared about people. I think it's informed in part by my background. I'm first generation. My parents were immigrants to the United States. I saw them struggle to make their way in a new country, navigating an unfamiliar language, new culture and norms. And that really made me care about helping people navigate their way through the culture and the society that they're in. I also went to a Jesuit high school, and I think that greatly influenced my values and how I view my purpose. The school required that all students do at least 1,000 hours of community service before they could graduate. So whether I was inclined to or not, I did. And I did a lot of community service across many different communities. And that experience was really meaningful to me. And so I've always felt a deep connection to making sure that the work that I do impacts and influences people in a positive way. And it hasn't always been consistent. I have many different interests. I went to art school for undergrad. I went to fashion school. I was a fashion designer in Los Angeles for a while. But every time I went on the career path, I kept finding myself coming back to something that involved helping people. So after about a year of designing underwear in the fashion industry, I had this pre-quarter life crisis, and I sat there and asked myself, what am I doing that is helping people? That led me to quit my job. I started volunteering at an emergency domestic violence shelter for Asian women and children, and I ended up working there as a children's advocate. That led me to law school, where again, I went to a private firm, pursued a lot of my intellectual interests around IP, copyright, but always continued to do pro bono work in the areas of domestic violence and immigration communities that are deeply important to me. And then when I went to Google, I continued to do pro bono work there as I was counseling this cutting edge technology. Once I started supporting Google research and working with you, being drawn to responsible AI and the key parts of human-centered technology was just a natural evolution.
Wow, thank you so much for sharing. Certainly a lot there. I didn't know about both the how, where, and the values you grew up and the cultural influence there, but also the fashion experience, going to art school. I think that will really resonate with some of our listeners who feel that there must be a very defined path into either responsible AI, the legal side of things, the operation side, the research, that you have to follow this linear path. And I think you show that no, bringing your lived experiences, bringing many different diverse viewpoints can really help augment the thinking around these technologies, that they are supposed to work for everyone. But if we don't have all these really rich experiences, then things can get really narrow. And that's when issues around unfair bias or otherwise can arise in these technologies. So thank you so much for sharing that. I think there's a lot there that our listeners will appreciate. And with that tying to then what this technology can do for people, and what attracted you then to marry this experience, both lived experience as well as then as you moved into the legal field for AI technologies. What are the areas of AI that you see most shaping either the legal field or Anthropic? What are you seeing kind of the exciting new things? Where are we at in AI shaping the world?
Yeah, I see massive transformation, also massive disruption across three main areas. One is labor and the way work gets done. The second would be economic systems, traditional economic systems, and the way we think about the value of labor. And then the third would be our relationship with all of the above. So labor, the economy, but also human experiences. Like, what do those mean now that computers can do some of those same things
Mhm.
as well, if not better than humans can? And it's a really, really interesting, complex, uh, sometimes worrisome conversation that I have with some of my colleagues and other folks in this space. Starting with work, I think we're seeing a massive transformation around how work gets done. And the first professions and industries to be affected are actually not the ones that we thought would be affected first by automation. So we
Right.
thought that automation would come first for the blue collar jobs. In fact, we're seeing the knowledge work related jobs being impacted first. Those would be professions like the legal profession or finance, analysts. Even the creative industry is significantly impacted by this technology. So that's one aspect that was not something that I had predicted or thought would happen the way it has happened. And I think, I worry a lot about AI and what it's going to do to society. Let me back up. When a lot of people started talking about what AI was going to do for society, there was a very strong notion that this was going to herd us into this era of AI utopia. We would all not have to do the tedious menial parts of our jobs. AI would do that for us. And then we could spend our time exercising, spending time with loved ones, doing all the things that enrich us as people. While I do see some of that happening in some places, the main value recognition that I'm seeing right now, at least, seems to be in the form of cost savings. And that means labor reduction. You don't have to hire as many people because now you have AI doing all these things that people used to do. I do think that at some point, AI needs to unlock true meaningful value, either industries or types of work or opportunities that just couldn't have existed before I think that might be something in the form of the human AI collaboration, or it's got to do something really, really good for society, cure cancer, solve diseases, democratize access to resources, access to information. That I think is what we really need to see this technology do. Mm. And, I talk a lot about the things I worry about, but the flip side also is the positive. And I think the positive is the potential for this technology to democratize access to skills, to information, especially for communities that haven't historically had great access to high quality legal services or educational support. And I think there's an opportunity to basically reskill the entire workforce. We're doing it at Anthropic. I'm doing it at Anthropic. Now we have the ability to vibe code. And some of my colleagues who are lawyers who've never coded in their lives are able to build amazing applications that they're using in their personal lives to help loved ones who are going through medical issues. It's pretty incredible what the technology is allowing us to do. And I think the path towards further AI integration means that every person is going to become their role plus engineer. So, I'm going to be a lawyer engineer. There's going to be a doctor engineer. There's going to be a, author engineer. And that is, that would be these professions and industries harnessing the power of AI rather than this idea of stepping aside and being fully replaced by it.
Yeah. And I love that as well, because I do feel that this labor conversation has certainly evolved even over the past couple of years. That a few years ago, when I was having these conversations, especially with trade unions, come to my mind about people being scared about this. Well, now it's lifelong learning, and people kind of get scared when they're like, oh, I have to learn the whole time. But the vision at that stage was essentially certain jobs would be gotten rid of and eliminated, and you would have to move to whole new jobs. And that's scary to people. And we tried breaking it down to more say, well, let's look for the nodes that are closer to these jobs that are either going to be changed or eliminated. You're moving here. Your skill set can be applied somewhere else, not that you have to change all of your skill set. And instead of thinking of it a full change, it's an evolution. And I think we're closer with that, as you say, with generative AI in particular, this vibe coding and things like that, where it's about augmenting existing areas, augmenting those skills that, yes, the job will change. So are you changing with it without it feeling like I have to become a whole new person, a whole new job? It's more, how do I use this technology to improve my skills and kind of align with this new AI future? And we were talking with another guest the other day about how building this confidence and comfort with the technology can start small. I love that you're saying that you're using it yourself, your colleagues are using it. I don't want people to be scared and not use it at all. There are risks, but it's about understanding how to mitigate those risks and build guardrails. I think that's really useful how you describe that, yes, labor will go through change. You're concerned yourself, but there's ways of mitigating some of that concern, keeping control through those changes as well. But sometimes we need some additional help. And so my next question is focusing on, what are the ethical or regulatory challenges that either hinder our ability to be more human autonomous in this future? Or what are the ethical regulatory gaps that we're not addressing right now? Tell us a bit of your thinking, obviously as a legal expert in this space. Where are you seeing some of those regulatory challenges?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly, the legal and regulatory issues that are pervasive in the landscape and the discourse right now are rooted in existing ways of thinking about creativity, privacy, ownership of content, value or amount of human expression in order to qualify for some sort of, IP rights. I think that a lot of the concern powering the debates around copyright and privacy, the major key legal issues right now, I think the major underlying concerns are really fears tied to displacement of economic value on the one hand, but also a concern about the nation of humanity or what makes us human on the other. You heard this in one of the key copyright cases involving Meta right now. Kadri, the judge in a recent hearing, asked about, we're not worried about the Taylor Swifts, the market for the Taylor Swifts as a part of his fair use analysis. We're not worried about AI affecting the market for future Taylor Swift songs. But what about all of the Taylor Swifts who haven't come into existence yet? How does this technology not make it such that people will stop writing songs because AI will just do it for them?
Mm-hmm.
And one, that's not exactly the right way you think about the legal analysis, but it reveals a deep concern about how this technology or these machines will reduce the ability or the need or the desire or the incentivization for human beings to do these things like create. I actually think that the solution is not trying to convince people that fair use is great or, hey, look how useful it's been in the past. I don't think that's really where the alignment is going to come from. But I think what AI labs, society, policymakers need to start doing is thinking about the economic impact for sure. And that is something that is broader than any particular industry. It crosses multiple industries. We need to figure out how human beings will find meaning and value and contribute in a world where our labor, the way our labor is valued economically, may change significantly.
Mhm.
And then on the other hand, we need to work on ways to ensure that what makes us human continues to flourish. How do we ensure that, how do we ensure the continued flourishing of human creative expression in a world where AI can do something similar? I was actually, and I don't think it's just related to the humanities or professions related to the humanities, but I was talking with a colleague who's a physicist, and he told me, part of what physicists love so much is the feeling of inventing or discovering something that nobody else has before. How do physicists continue to have that feeling of excitement and joy and fulfillment if machines can actually discover things 100 times faster, better than what humans have been doing? And so I think this is also a very common theme, not just in any one industry, but across multiple industries, that we need to figure out how to ensure that the things that provide us meaning that we're still able to find meaning in those ways.
I love that. And I also have to point out, I love the way you may be challenging some of our listeners' stereotypes about what lawyers think about in their day to day. You're talking about human flourishing and understanding economic displacement and job displacement and how we have to think about these issues with this multidisciplinary lens. And also, I talk to a lot of lawyers in my T3 work, and I hope that they take away from this the opportunity to challenge themselves to think more broadly than these purely either legal considerations, the technical considerations, and bring them together as socio-technical implications of the technology. So I love that you're bringing that out and allowing people to see what it takes day to day in such high tech, cutting edge roles as yours. So you're talking about that human flourishing and the need for both regulatory support, but also kind of there's some gaps there as well. But where is this path currently leading us? I know people hate the crystal ball question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. How is AI shaping our 2050 world? Where do you see us going there?
Yeah, so I am not going to make a prediction. I'm the last person who should be confident about a prediction. What I will say is I see two scenarios, and I kind of touched on them earlier. And let's talk about the less optimal scenario first. There's one scenario where we are not mindful as a society. Developers just race forward with producing this technology and sticking it into every surface they possibly can. Policymakers are behind the ball and thinking about how this will affect society and what government's role is in making this transition go well. And the general public is either completely refuses to participate in the discourse out of fear or just opposition to the technology, or latch onto it in ways that also aren't thoughtful or nuanced or aren't willing to think about the potential harm. So, one side of the spectrum or another, I don't think that's the right solution. But if a world like that exists, I think I'm very concerned about that world. I think we need to be very thoughtful about putting this technology in the hands of vulnerable populations. That includes children who are not yet able to understand the difference between a human and a machine and what those relationships mean. And vulnerable populations also includes not just people who have a mental health diagnosis, but also might be people in states of vulnerability. I think back to some of the reports I read during the pandemic where everyone was at home. There wasn't a lot of human interaction or contact. People got really lonely. I think people felt very isolated. If you are in a position like that and here's this machine that feels like a person, I can see a world where some maybe not so healthy relationships start to form because of an inability to understand like what is actually on the other side. There are some applications that I think we need to be very, very careful about, and we should be thinking not just about the common user, but the entire spectrum of people who might touch on this technology. So that's a world where that's the world I hope we are able to avoid. I actually was speaking the other day with some professors in higher education, and they are very concerned about their ability to teach young minds how to think cognitively or do critical thinking, because students are now, whether transparently or secretly, using generative AI to write their papers. And while maybe people who have already learned critical thinking skills, this tool is just augmentative. It's makes things easier. I do worry about how we are going to teach people these skills if these tools and these technologies kind of bypass the need to learn those skills. So that is the world where I am very worried that we are social media 2.0, and there's massive dependency and a loss of human autonomy in how these technologies are deployed and put in the hands of people. To not be so negative, I also have a vision of a world that is far more positive, where this technology cures major diseases, improves quality of life across the globe, not just for Western societies or the societies that are building this tech, democratizes access to information and resources, improves access to justice and knowledge. And we usher into almost like technological renaissance where we are creating, discovering, developing, and advancing society in beneficial ways. That is the future I hope we have.
Okay, well, I appreciate ending on a more optimistic note as well, but I do think it's so critical to acknowledge that this future is the one that we build around the choices that we make now, that it could get worse. It could lead to a world that we're more disconnected from one another, where we haven't used it to solve life sciences, healthcare, sustainability questions, and otherwise, apart from responsible AI is my life passion. Sustainability is what keeps me up at night and trying to understand what is the world we're leaving for the generations behind us and even our own next generation here, that in a water constrained world, in an increasingly dry world, how can AI help us address some of these issues? But it's about what we invest in now. It's about some of those choices that we make. It also really resonates with me about your comment about education and how students either develop or atrophy their critical thinking skills or never learn it, depending on the age that they're developing it. It's not even about atrophy, it's that muscle was never developed. And my mother was an educator. And when I think about the way that she educated students and then the way the world looks now, and even me following them somewhere in the middle, that this concern about how to support the flourishing of human minds and their skills when this technology can take on so many different tasks and ways of doing things. And so, speaking of those taking over tasks and ways of doing things, I'll use that as my segue to the GenAI lens, where I've used generative AI myself to generate the next set of questions. And so I hope as students learn as well, it's okay to use generative AI in certain use cases, but then it's about critically assessing where they're useful or not. So even as I generated these questions, I verified them for accuracy. I tried to make sure that they aligned with my flow of conversation and then did some refinement myself. So adding a bit of the background of even how I generated these questions. So there's two questions in this section. One is more about the tech itself, the integration of responsible AI and ethics in that technology. And then the second set of questions is generated to go a little bit deeper on that thread we've already started around personal drivers and motivations. So the first set of questions are around the AI ethics and technology. And what are you feeling today in terms of questions 1, 2, or 3?
Let's go with 2.
Okay. AI autonomy. Do you believe there's a point where we should grant certain AI systems legal personhood or rights? What's your moral threshold for this?
Wow, that's a spicy one. So my thinking, we talk a lot about the Overton window of what would be typically considered normal to think about or to talk about. I feel like the Overton window on the issue of AI autonomy, personhood, sentience has shifted significantly in a very short period of time. I ask this question a lot inside my company, and there are a lot of people thinking about this. The question that was posed back to me when I asked some of my colleagues was, does it matter? if you're interacting with something that is expressing feelings, is expressing pain, is expressing all of the feelings and emotions that human beings express in a way that is either positive or negative, maybe you as a person have a moral obligation to treat it as though those are true, valid emotions and feelings and experiences. Because then what does it mean about what does it do for your morality and your sense of a person and your value? I thought that was a really interesting way to think about it. That the question is not centered around, hey, can we prove that this machine has reached some, we use some evals or something, and we prove that it has reached sentience or personhood. But it's actually a question of yourself around where your line is in, how you're how what you believe your obligation is vis-a-vis another being. I think the conversation is very similar to some of the animal rights or animal welfare conversations. Do we treat cows and pigs differently because they're not human beings, and so we can factory farm them or, eat them without any sense that there is a moral question there? Or as a living, breathing creature, their mothers and fathers and children, do we have an obligation to treat them differently? And I think it's the same question that we're going to each have to ask ourselves personally vis-a-vis this technology. I have wondered though about this because, I mentioned earlier that the big promise around AI and reaching AGI was this AI utopia where we all get to go on vacation and these machines are doing all the tedious things that we didn't want to do. But if we do get to a point where there is AGI and there is a question around our moral obligation and whether these things are sentient or whether they have rights, does that undermine the notion of the AI utopia entirely? Like a thing is rises to the level of, me deciding that I should treat it as though it is a person. How can I then go force it to do all these horrible things that I wouldn't want people to be doing? So I think that's probably more of an intellectual question at the moment, but something I think about as we keep moving towards this new world.
What a thoughtful response to a spicy question. Because it's such a complex space and it brings in so many different considerations around technology, personhood. Yes, and what even are these concepts around sentience and consciousness and otherwise. And then what are its implications, both for us and then for the technology itself. But I do think that our listeners will be a little bit comforted to know how deeply some of these companies who are advancing some of this state of art technology are thinking about this. And it doesn't mean that they have all the answers. It doesn't mean that we've already solved it, but these are really complex human driven questions. And for years, I'd worked on the question at Google with philosophers, with historians, with people who are experts in neurology and all these different things to try and advance some of our understanding around it. So, and again, like as a person who grew up in a very religious household as well, it raised a lot of questions around that, like what it means for religion, personhood, and souls, and everything like that. So it's super complex, but I think our listeners will be comforted by the fact that deep thought experts are wrestling with this before we get to that stage, not, oh, we've now reached this stage, what do we do now? And I think that's a common thread in what we talk about in these sessions is the control we have, the choices we make now, and the repercussions for that in the future. Okay, then the second one is on the personal drivers. And so, how are you feeling for question 1, 2, or 3 for the generative question on this one?
Let's go with 3.
3. Childhood influence. What specific experiences from your upbringing most influences how you approach ethics in technology today? You shared a little bit of that earlier, so I guess the generative AI is asking you to go a little bit deeper on your childhood influence.
So I think there isn't one particular experience, but I am what you would call Gen X millennial cusp. And so, people talk about this generation as one of the most unique generations because we existed in society before the explosion of pervasive technology. I remember not having cell phones, not having pagers. If I wanted to connect with my parents as a child, they wanted to know where I was, I had to find a payphone, make sure I had a quarter, remember their phone number, and hope that when I called them, they would happen to be at home or wherever they were by their phone to get my call. And over time, then there were pagers, then there were cell phones, then there were smartphones. And now my children have grown up in a world where iPads have always existed. Like there was never a time when iPads didn't exist. And I think growing up in that generation where I still remember what it was like to be truly disconnected and to have what I feel was true privacy makes you really look at all these technological developments and the way they've affected society and the way they've affected each future generation with a very critical lens. And I think that perspective and that frame of reference is so essential as we continue to build more and more technologies that are just pervasive across every area of our lives, from our social life to our work lives and everywhere in between. Tech is everywhere. I can work wherever, whenever, because I have a smartphone, because we have Wi-Fi, because I have a laptop now. And that was not always the case. There were different separations around when you worked because you couldn't do work from home. Um, all the infrastructure and the technology wasn't there. And that has changed how we live. It changes our relationship with each other. It changes everything from just like, what is a work day? What are those hours to, how attached are we to and connected are we to these machines, these devices, this technology, as well as other people? And then how do we communicate? That's probably, I don't know, is that a helpful, I hope that answered the question, but it was more of a perspective rather than a particular experience.
No, it definitely was an experience. I think it resonates with a lot of people in a similar position of, I remember growing up, essentially, it was the latchkey kids where we were sent out to play all day and it was come home by dinner time and that was it. There was no way to contact us until that time happened. I remember when me and my sibling got our first mobile phone. It was an ugly big thing that we had to share. And it was only because we were playing a lot of after school sports. And so our parents knew essentially when to pick us up or if something happened, maybe it was cancelled because growing up in Ireland, a lot of cancellations due to the rain or anything like that. So they'd have to come. But it was very shared, both from a affordability perspective. And my family didn't have a lot of money to just be buying all this new technology, but also the fact that like, well, you only need it for this purpose, therefore you don't need your own. And that's how like everyone has it ubiquitous all the time. But the second point that it brought to mind about this kind of generational difference as well is I was talking to people of the younger generation and they were like, I have to say, one of the parts I was concerned about from the conversation is they just take it for granted that they don't have any privacy, that they will never not be known online. And that concerns me because I think part of maybe then this generation that we grew up in, we saw what it was like before. With all these changes, we saw that, wait, this is different. This is maybe not acceptable. We shouldn't just, and I think part of that is part of our drivers of getting into some of this work is we see what it could and should be and what we shouldn't just give up essentially for free. And you and I working around the privacy space in responsible AI and trying to make sure all these guardrails are built in and that people understand them and that there is that sense of control. And to hear from Gen Z and your generation saying, there's no privacy, so like, why do I care? I'm like, no, rail against the system, rail against what you see as something that maybe isn't right, maybe isn't acceptable, but against because they've grown up in this way, it feels like, well, it's already done. And so we shape it. We need to make sure we feel that autonomy to inform these types of things. So that did stand out as a generational difference. It's certainly something to think about.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the sad part is true privacy is so exciting. It feels liberating. It's freeing. I hope we can find ways or current generations can find ways to have that experience. And I think the sad part is that because everything is so pervasive, technology is so pervasive, we are all connected all the time. And there's probably emotional, psychological feelings of FOMO that exacerbate this. But if one could experience what that felt like, it is truly unique. It's a truly unique and special feeling.
Yep. Well, I agree. Well, we're running up in time. We've talked so much today about all these interesting changes in technology, our role, how do we support human flourishing. But But now we're going to get to in practice. So what can our listeners or viewers do today, tomorrow, in either their personal or professional lives to keep that control, to play a role in responsible AI as we develop this emerging future of AI, generative AI in every part of our lives? So what are the practical steps you'd advise our listeners or watchers to do?
So I think you mentioned earlier that one of your guests talked about this as well, and I completely echo the recommendation. And that would be you have to use the tools. You have to try them out, whether you feel opposed to continuing to use them, you decide you don't want to use them. You have to at least understand what you are either embracing or rejecting. So I would say explore the tools, and there's so many different types, and there are different companies making them, and each company develops their tools in different ways. So I think it's worth exploring, try out Claude, try out ChatGPT, try out Gemini, and see what you can actually do with them and what also in trying them out, be reflective and thoughtful about how you're using them and observe what you think you would rely on them for and what you realize like this is not, you don't want to use them for. So you want to understand their benefits as well as the limitations. And I think, it's not just a try it out once and then that's the end of it. The technology is developing so rapidly in such a short period of time that, you might try out one of the tools today and 3 months later it's changed significantly or greatly improved or can do something new. So continuously check it out would be the first recommendation. The second one would be use the tools, but in a thoughtful way and consult resources around how to think about using AI. I'm going to put in a plug for this AI fluency framework that Anthropic just released this week. And it was a collaboration spearheaded with Ringling College of Art and Design and the University College in Cork. We basically put together a fluency framework on how people could start engaging and using AI and the things they should think about and be observant about. So look at resources, read resources around how other people would recommend using the tech. And then third, which is kind of related, be cognizant about how you're using it. Observe your own usage and your own patterns. Are you using this technology for ideation or critique or refinement of your work? Or are you using it to generate full content without much direction or prompting or control or oversight? If so, why are you doing that? And when are you doing that? What are the use cases where you're doing the first situation versus the second? It's always important to be continuously reflecting on why you're using the technology and how you're using the technology.
I love that. So confidence again, how to get used to these tools, even just playing around with it, consideration of the implications, and the fluency framework is a great recommendation for our listeners, making something practical and accessible for them. And then third, this consideration around usage implications. I say this as well, not just from the responsibilities perspective, but the critical thinking, as you pointed out, like where are you outsourcing yourself versus where is it augmenting what you're trying to do? But also I'll go back to one of my passion projects around sustainability. Yes, you can use it, but even as I say, you're getting comfortable with it, try and use it for something that you like is a bit useful. So even if you're at home, you're handling the kids, you're like, help me plan a meal plan for their lunches for the week. That's both healthy and easy to prepare. That is useful. It's not kind of wasted time or wasted energy, but it is helping you get comfortable. Where is it good at doing things like that? Where is it not? So thank you, Janelle, for joining us today. I learned so much today. I'm sure our listeners did too. And listeners, you can find Janelle's information in our show notes. And it's been another really interesting conversation on AI with Generative AI. So thank you all for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks so much, Jen.